Well, thank you for coming to my talk. Why do people do really bad things? And what I'm going to speak about in this presentation is some of the whys of genocide, why it happens. And this is a fairly dark presentation. I've had people asked if I could do this particular one, and sometimes I steer them away to some of my other ones. But even though this is a dark talk, I mean, these are somewhat dark times, and perhaps it's apropos. I mean, we have this invasion of Ukraine that's going on by Russia. That's wreaking a lot of devastation and death over there in the country of Ukraine, causing a massive refugee crisis. Now, you should know, in terms of total disclosure here, both sets of my grandparents were from the Ukraine. So I have a bias coming into this. So you have a bias. I have a biased speaker here talking about the topic. One of the things that we've seen a lot in the news is this talk about World War III. And one of the reasons they're saying that is that there's such close parallels between Putin and some of the things that Hitler did in terms of the genesis of World War II. I mean, Putin started out with this kind of annexation of Crimea and this invasion of Ukraine, where Hitler started out with this annexation of Austria and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And some of the parallels here are actually kind of scary. I mean, Hitler was largely motivated by this defeat and humiliation of Germany after World War I. Similarly, many of the analysts have said Putin is motivated by his anguish over the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Hitler, of course, asserted dictatorial power, and we know Putin has a record of brutally suppressing opponents, the press, and protesters. Hitler demanded sacrifices of the German people to build the Third Reich, and Putin has equated the pain of sanctions with Russian patriotism. Hitler questioned the existence of Czechs as a nation, and Putin similarly questioned Ukrainian statehood, saying they never actually had the traditions of real statehood. They were artificially created by the Soviet Union, which is false. And you can go on and on. I mean, quote by Hitler, "I've declared that the frontier between France and Germany is a final one." Of course, he violated that. And of course, Putin violated the Budapest Agreement, an agreement for the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear missiles. Russia acknowledged them as a sovereign state, which of course they're violating. Hitler was appeased by Chamberlain and the Munich Agreement. West reacted weakly to Putin's invasion of Crimea and Georgia. Trump actually tried to exit NATO, and he was blocked by that by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his Bolton, who was the security secretary. Hitler was appeased by Chamberlain and the Munich Agreement, and West reacted very weakly to the invasion of Crimea and Georgia. And also, there was this American First movement that was trying to stay out of World War II. And ironically, there is this American Firsters we have that's over on the far right of the political spectrum that has actually been supporters of Putin. So it's almost scary when you look at the parallels that existed. And of course, just as Hitler was accused of atrocities, we have now accusations of war crime by Putin. Intentional shelling bombings of civilians, the use of outlawed weapons, whether they be cluster bombs or vacuum bombs, which are bombs that were meant to take out very deep bunkers by sucking all the oxygen out of a space. And he's been accused of using these against some civilian targets. Of course, there's been violations of the ceasefire agreements that some of the humanitarian convoys have been unable to get food and medicine and supplies into some of these people in these besieged cities. And many people fear a repeat in Kyiv or other cities of the Soviet Union of what happened with the Russian forces in Syria, where they basically bombed Aleppo and other cities into the ground. Of course, Ukraine has suffered through some atrocities in the past. 4 million Ukrainians died of a famine engineered by Stalin in the early 30s to punish the Ukrainians for their resistance to his collective farming. About 25% of the population, 10 million, did not survive World War II. And 4 million Ukrainian civilians were executed by the Nazis during World War II. or a million Jews plus another 3 million Slavs. And many people are familiar with the Jews that were executed, but a lot of people aren't familiar with the execution of the Slavs, the mass execution that took place. So I have prepared a little slideshow, and you could kind of read the slides as they go through, and it'll give you a little overview, a little bit more about the extent of the Nazi democide that happened during World War II, which was much more extensive than many people are aware of. So I'll start that off and you could read through it as it goes. Yeah, let me highlight just a couple of things that you saw in that particular slideshow. They talked about general plan ops, which was created in the latter part of 1939 and the early part of 1940. And that plan was the idea that Germany was seen to be overpopulated and overcrowded. They didn't have the kind of room to basically grow the Third Reich as far as the Nazis were planning it out. So the idea was that they were going to seize territory. Got a little glitch here. They were going to seize territory that was occupied by all of these Slavic countries. Okay, my slides aren't advancing. I'm going to have to stop the share just for a second. I'm sorry. They wanted to occupy this area, but it was populated by 75 million Slavs. Well, what to do about these 75 million Slavs? Well, General Ops, that plan was to execute 45 million of them, and then enslave the other 30 million of them as slave labor to work under the Germans occupying that area. And that's where the term actually came from in terms of master race, that they were going to be the master race over this Slavic dominion and with these enslaved people underneath them. And as it was mentioned in the slides, the Germans studied a whole series of different genocides in the past to try to carry this off. There's a famous quote by Hitler. Our strength lies in our intensive attacks and our barbarity. He was talking about killing off Poles. After all, he said, who remembers the genocide of the Armenians, showing how they studied these past genocides. And they took a methodological approach, step by step, to the genocides, where they selected a particular group for extermination. And then they had a kind of a PR campaign justifying it, and then they would gauge worldwide reactions. So they kind of started off with this execution of these prisoners, with the idea, and they came out with a campaign after that, we're making Germany safer by executing all of these dangerous people. And then they went after disabled people, okay, with the idea that was this eugenics, that we're trying to purify the population. So they did this and did a PR campaign, and they didn't get much pushback at all. And after that, they just stopped the follow-up PR campaigns, and they just started executing the groups. And nobody pushed back. And that was kind of the key, and that was captured by the famous piece that was written by Martin Niemöller, where he said, first they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Now, originally, Hitler was going to expel all the Jews from the Third Reich, and 2/3 of the Jewish population were able to flee Germany. But what happened was Hitler and the German banks basically made this deal to seize all the monetary assets of the Jews. And once they seized all the monetary assets, the Jews had no resources actually then to leave the country. And this was called the Jewish dilemma or the Jewish problem. So to solve this, they decided in 1942 to fold them into the extermination plan for the General Plan Office, and all that carnage followed. And unfortunately, there have been a series of different genocides that have happened throughout the 20th century, in addition to what happened during World War II with the Nazis. And people have done research saying, well, how could this possibly happen in a civilized world? And one of the first research efforts that were made was made by Theodor Adorno in the early 1950s. And he was kind of researching the roots of this anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust and the execution of the Jews. And he came up with this concept of the F scale, the authoritarian personality scale. It's been nicknamed the fascist scale. And what he did is he did this kind of psychological test on all these people. And he gave them these questions. For example, obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. And this is one of the first uses of what is called this Likert scale, this agree and disagree. And you went through a whole battery of these questions, and then he classified certain people having this thing called an authoritarian personality, this kind of fascist personality. And he felt these are the people who would be the perpetrators of these types of atrocities. And he had a theory basically coming out of it that it was due to these repressed emotions, due to bad parenting. It's very much tied into Freudian philosophy. Well, there were issues with his research in terms of some question bias and how he used the scales and interpreted the scales, and also pushing back on some of these Freudian theories that underlined it. But one of the things that seemed to undo this a lot was an interview, an event that happened in 1963 that was done by Hannah Arendt, who interviewed Adolf Eichmann back in 1942. And this interview kind of came to light, and it was published, it got a lot of publicity because it was picked up by the New Yorker, because they thought this would be kind of juicy things, having this dialogue and this revelation from this kind of this maniac, this madman. But what happened was, after getting a battery of different psychology tests to Adolf Eichmann and all of these type of things, he did not come across as any type of maniac at all. As a matter of fact, when different psychologists looked at the results of the different testing he undertook, one of them said, this guy looks more normal than I do. Right? He didn't appear to be anything like this kind of Jew-hating kind of maniac. If anything, he was kind of just this bureaucrat. And there was this term coined, the banality of evil. And it was said that the great evils were not executed by fanatics or sociopaths, but ordinary people, somewhat like Eichmann, who accepted the view that their actions were the normal way that things should be done. And he's just following through on this bureaucratic procedure. So he didn't really look like anything like some type of a fascist personality or someone that was high on the authoritarian scale that Adorno was trying to isolate. And this was followed up by other types of experiments that took place in the 70s. Famous experiments by Malkin with students in electric shock, where he gave them rewards for upping the scale on an electric shock to a fellow student. And of course, it was all kind of a phony shock. He had basically kind of actors in the next room, and they would scream out and mock pain, if the dials were turned up. And it was just unbelievable how much they would turn up these dials to make these fellow students suffer to get a higher reward. And the famous psychology experiments by Zimbardo over at Stanford, where he segregated the students into prisoners and guards and saw how quickly the guards started abusing these prisoners. When they went back and looked at the 20th century genocides in light of some of this other research, and they analyzed a lot of the demographics, one of the things that jumped out was that there was no trend in terms of a particular group perpetrating these things in these various societies. When they looked at the various people who engineered and actually perpetrated the atrocities, they actually looked like a general cross-section of the population. very similar to what happened when they went back and analyzed people that were the perpetrators of the World War II democide. And this was brought home even more, actually, kind of recently, in a movie that Roman Polanski did called The Pianist, that talked about the atrocities against the Jews in World War II. And he was a apropos person to make this movie because he was actually imprisoned in one of the ghettos in World War II. His mother was executed at a concentration camp and his father was sent to slave labor, and he was able to escape out of the ghetto. But one of the things he said was that it's important for people to understand that there were good Jews and bad Jews, good Poles and bad Poles, good Germans and bad Germans, because that's how it really was. And he highlighted in this movie the role of Jews that the Nazis recruited as these ghetto police. And many of these Jewish ghetto police committed some very horrible atrocities. And then the interesting thing is when they went back and looked at the proportion of these people participating as the Jewish ghetto police to the total population of the ghetto, it fit this general demographics of the population unbelievably, right? Similar to these other groups they saw and these other genocides that they saw. So in light of all of this and this recurring theme, what came out was this statement by David Motion that researchers followed up on. He said that, in the study of genocide, what we want is different from what we need. What we want is a theory of how these perpetrators of genocide differ from us. What we need is a theory that explains how people like us, with motivations like ours, can commit genocide. They seem to be just a cross-section of the population. So this was done with decades of research, looking at how typical people can be motivated to commit these types of crimes. And a lot of it was confined to academic papers, but it became much more widespread and publicly revealed as a result of a book that came out in the 1990s by a fellow by the name of Goldhagen. And evidently he proposed something as a PhD thesis that was rejected, but he turned around and published it as a book and followed up with 2 other books. And it was kind of this big bestseller. And unfortunately, it was based upon a lot of bogus research. He had a theory that the Holocaust, the genocide in World War II, was caused by the Catholic Church, that they had this repression of Jews going back to the Middle Ages, and they kept escalating it and escalating it and escalating it until it exploded in this mass executions that happened during the Nazi regime. And unfortunately, it was bogus because he got our history wrong, because there wasn't any kind of big buildup. The persecution of Jews actually happened in different waves, going up and down throughout history. And he got the participants wrong because it doesn't explain how people who weren't associated with the church, with other churches, or weren't church going at all, participated on this. And he got the kind of victims wrong because he never explained, well, how does that explain the execution of the Slavs and the Roma and all these other people? Plus, he got psychology wrong in terms of talking about this explosion where actually it was something in psychology called the gradient effect, where people work harder to achieve a goal once they get kind of close to it. But for a whole series of these reasons, the research community kind of jumped on this and said, he's putting out the wrong message. But the good part about all of this is because of this, there were a huge flurry of books that came out in the early 2000s that tried to set the record straight based upon the research that was done. And they kind of explained more this research of explaining of why do common people participate in these type of horrible genocide events. So what do these books and what does this research actually say in terms of typical people committing atrocities? Well, a lot of it had to go back to brain science, how your brain works and how your brain circuitry works. I mean, you have all these different areas of your brain that control different types of things. And to make kind of a gross generalization, roughly you got a lot of things in your primitive brain that handle emotion. And then your frontal cortex, you got a lot of logical centers that kind of say, okay, wait a second, let's not get over emotional, let's logically look at that. And then your upper brain, you've got a lot of judgment areas. that balance things between your emotions and logic, but also bring into mind things like compassion and mercy, as a good judge would. Well, if you look at it, there are people who in history have been able to manipulate these different brain circuits and basically be able to bias them. And they do this with a particular way. Sometimes it's been called a hate story. And some people have been particularly adept in history at manipulating hate stories.
Und weil dieser beste Rassenwert der deutschen Nation in einer stolzen Selbsteinschätzung, mutig und kühn die Führung des Reiches und Volkes forderte, hat das Volk.
Yeah, you saw there the video of Hitler, and at the end you could see Mussolini standing there as well. Well, their hate stories that they generated, Hitler and other peoples and other genocides, all had a similar construction. There was a threat, there was a dehumanization step, and there was a victimization threat. Victimization step, excuse me. Now, these things can really mess up your brain circuitry. If we start out with the first step, the threat. Well, how does this work? Well, when evolutionary psychologists look at your brain, one of the things they see is that we have circuits that were embedded in our brain to help us survive. For example, it was much more healthy for people to eat ripe fruit than unripe fruit. Ripened fruit has more nutrition, it has more sugars that we can process, it has more vitamins and minerals. And so the human brain developed this seek circuit to look for a pleasure center for sweetness, because ripe fruit tends to be sweeter than unripe fruit, which tends to be sour. So by building a sweetness and a pleasure center to seek out sweetness, people were then favoring the ripe fruit that was better for them. And scientists say today that the vestige of that is many people's kind of sweet tooth. People have this sweet tooth, and that goes way back to this brain circuit to eat ripened vegetables and ripened fruit. Well, we have brain circuits as well that were evolved to basically have threats and respond with aggression. For example, this kind of retaliation circuit, that somebody injures you, does a threat, and you come retaliate back with some type of aggression. And there's also kind of a revenge justice circuit, that someone may injure you, but you're not in a position then to retaliate back. So you incorporate some other third party to retaliate for you. All right. Back in caveman days, it would be Og, the bigger caveman, right? But today we go into a justice system, the courts. But there's also another circuit that exists there, and this is this circuit that gets manipulated with the hate stories, and that's something called redirected aggression. That's where somebody injures you, but you turn around and rather than retaliating against who injured you, you retaliate against some other third party. And it seems bizarre. Now, why would you do something like that? And why would you have a circuit like that? Well, it's very common, actually. Most people do these things. If I was doing this talk and everything started to go wrong, right? Oh, geez, the things go wrong, and I get all mad about it. And so when I leave, I go and I slam the door, because it bothered me. And some people, get all riled up and they get aggressive driving, drive home because they're all mad about something hurt that happened to them. They could escalate even further. Somebody comes home and snaps at their wives and kids, right? Or you walk in and get into a bar fight, right? You've heard this expression. That guy walked into the bar looking for a fight, right? Something happened to threaten him, and he goes to take it out on some other third party. And of course, this could escalate into very serious things like domestic abuse or some types of murders and killings. Why would your brain ever have a circuit like that, where something injures you, and rather than going back to the party injured you, take it out on somebody else? Well, evolutionary psychologists think it goes back to this pack hierarchy. Just like if you have like a pack of wolves or dogs or something like that. If they all exist in this hierarchy, well, if the leader did something to harm the second in command dog, the second in command dog might not be in a position to go back and harm the leader, but he doesn't want to lose his position as second in command, so he goes and he harms someone that's third in command, right? And the third in command person hurts the fourth in command person to keep their position. So it kind of evolved from this pack hierarchy, trying to sustain that vestiges in our brain. And this happens tragically among people. Here's an example of redirected aggression where this mosque was destroyed over in Bosnia. And this particular researcher is talking. And he's saying, as I was standing alongside the rubble-strewn parking lot on the site of what had recently been one of the most splendid ancient mosques west of Istanbul, I asked a passing Serb student by what justification this and all the town's other mosques had been leveled. The Serb student said, because of what the Austro, the Bosnians, did to us during the Second World War. They leveled our Orthodox churches, he replied without the slightest hesitation. Only the Austrians were the Croats and the Bosnians. So he destroyed this mosque against the Muslims because of something that the Croats and Bosnians did to him way back in the Second World War. And this threat part, it basically activates this fight or flight response. So it activates these incredibly fiery emotions. And this fire can just keep building upon itself. It used to be think that if you act out the aggression, somehow it calms you down, but it doesn't. It just feeds the flames. Matter of fact, they used to do these exercises with these psychotherapists, where they gave people these little pillow things to hit on each other to get out their aggressions. And what they discovered was actually that just fed the flames and made people even more aggressive when they were done. So what happens is this fire of the threat can burn so hot, it can actually just burn out and obscure the logic and mercy sections of your brain. And this fire just burns really, really hot. And people are good at manipulating this fire. Here's a quote from Hermann Göring. And he said, well, of course, people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best that he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along. Whether there is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for their lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Now, you say there, well, this fire is burning. Why can't your logic center, basically frontal cortex, take over and extinguish the flames? Say, wait, logically, let's think about this. We're getting overly emotional here. Let's calm down and kind of look at the facts. Well, this is where the second part of the hate story comes in terms of the victimization. They did a survey among different Israelis, and they asked him if they felt that it was unjust that some of the Palestinians that were innocent of committing any type of terrorism were suffering as part of these retribution raids on the part of the Israeli army. And they came back, and when they did the survey, many Israelis said no, they felt this was unjust, that these innocent Palestinians had to suffer because of that. But then what they did is they gave the survey again. And they showed these Israelis, before they did the survey, a bunch of information, a little short film about the Holocaust. And when they did the survey again, the second time after viewing that, Israelis answered that no, they didn't think it was unjust that these other innocent Palestinians had to suffer. That was just part of, getting things in order and trying to control the situation. And they did a similar survey in the United States.
It does not appear that.
And they asked them if it was unjust that a lot of these innocent Iraqi citizens suffered as a part of this invasion of Iraq by the Allied forces. And people came and said, yes, it's unfortunate these innocent people had to suffer. But then they did the same thing. They showed a bunch of Americans this little clip of the bombing of the World Trade Center before they took the survey.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
Oh my God. That looks like a second plane.
Well, when they showed them this clip before they took the survey, then they answered the survey and they said that, no, they didn't think that it was a bad thing that these Iraqi citizens who didn't do anything got injured. It's just part of warfare. So they took it a step further. And rather than showing them this little film of the World Trade Center, they actually showed them some little clips of the bombing of Pearl Harbor in World War II. And they showed them this thing about the bombing of World War II. And then they took the survey and they came back and said, no, I didn't think it was bad that these innocent Iraqi citizens had to suffer. There's something about showing a victimization in the past that skews your logic center, that basically skews it in such a way that you don't really see this equitable type of judgment that you would normally have towards innocent people. What's interesting is when they've done studies of suicide bombers, and they did a study of over 300 of them, they concluded that the common denominator was not religious fundamentalism that drove them to be suicide bombers, but this perceived past injustice and victimization. And this thing could get built up where they kind of blame everything that happens in their past. Here's an example of an interview that was done with the Ku Klux Klanman. And this was a researcher by the name of Dr. Coles. And he was doing research for Psychology magazine, Psychology Today. He said, I'll never forget an interview I did in 1963 with a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a desperate, hateful man pouring out his frustrations and bitterness, his lifelong resentments and failures. His language was full of obscenities and self-revealing and self-debasing cries for struggle and social upheaval, as if then he would have his much wanted and needed second chance to show himself, able to make something of himself in this world. He was urging really a war of all against all. He was mad, I thought. Yet he was also an ordinary American working man, having a fairly hard time making a living and with lots of sickness in his family and little money to greet the growing stack of bills on his kitchen table. I told him in a moment of exasperation that he seemed to be arguing the desirability of one more world war, and that I doubted that human life on this planet would survive such an outcome. He looked at me sharply and long, and I girded myself for still additional irrationalities, banalities, and decencies. Instead, he said this: there's a side of everyone that's mean as can be. There's another side that's good, like my 7-year-old daughter can be most of the time. What makes the difference is how you live. If you've got a lousy life, the meanness wins. If you've got things pretty good, you have a better chance of being nice to others. The same goes with countries. And where this manifests itself very often is in the use of scapegoats, where everything that goes wrong gets piled upon a particular target, victimization. And the scapegoat concept goes back to ancient Israel, where they had the temple at Jerusalem, and they would do this cleansing of the temple ceremony once a year, where the priest would bring in 2 goats. One was sacrificed, the other one they would place their hands on and place all the iniquities and sins of the state of Israel onto this goat, and then send the goat out to the wilderness, let it escape. So that's what they term scapegoat. But there's masters at basically victimization and scapegoating, whether it was Hitler or their Armenians or many other genocides that happened. So we could have this threat fire burning, and we could use victimization to basically skew our logic centers in such a way that it never puts out the fire. But we also have that upper brain, our mercy and compassion. Why doesn't that enter in to basically quell all of this down? Well, that's where the other element comes in, the dehumanization. And the process of dehumanization is something that kind of builds, right? It starts with an us versus them type of dialogue. And You heard Hitler in that speech saying just those types of things. And then it escalates up to labeling and name calling. And then it kind of gets up to associating with past groups that are just reviled and such. Like, for example, in Rwanda, where they had the democide there were these hate radio stations that were there speaking out against the Tutsi. And they no longer even refer to them as Tutsi. They used a word that meant in Ugandan cockroach. We continually just refer to them as this cockroach, this dehumanization. And people have said that this is actually kind of almost a necessary and sufficient step for genocide. Because if you have the dehumanization part that basically quelches somebody's mercy and compassion, then you don't even need the threat part at all. You could just have these two elements to lead people to do these atrocities. And that's where we get into people who are just kind of bureaucrats, this banality of evil, that aren't driven so much by hate or emotion, but just this way that things should be done from these two things short-circuiting their brain. And here's a great example of it from Franz Stangl, who was the commandant of the Treblinka death camp. And one of the people that interviewed him was kind of shocked to learn that actually Franz Stangl didn't really hate the Jews. He didn't have any strong hatred for the Jews. In the interview asked him, would it be true to say that you finally felt that the Jews really weren't human beings? And Stangl said, when I was on a trip once, years later in Brazil, he said, his face deeply concentrated and obviously reliving the experience. My train stopped next to a slaughterhouse. The cattle in the pens, hearing the noise of the train, trotted up to the fence and stared at the train. They were very close to my window, one crowding the other, looking at me through that fence. I thought then, look at this. This reminds me of Poland. That's just how the people looked, trustingly, just before they went into the slaughter. What do you mean? But he went on without hearing an answer to me. I couldn't eat canned meat after that. Those big eyes which looked at me, not knowing that in no time they'd all be dead. He paused, his face was drawn. At that moment, he looked old and worn and real. So you didn't feel they were human beings. Cargo, he said tonelessly. They were cargo. And he raised and dropped his hand in a gesture of despair. Well, when they look at these 20th century genocides, again, in light of all of this research, one of the things they found was the common denominator of all of them wasn't this group of people or a certain demographic. It was actually this hate story. And the hate story had the same three components in every instance. And unfortunately, we could kind of see this currently with the Ukraine invasion and this same type of hate story coming up. If you look at Putin's hate story, for example, he says there's this threat, right? The West is using Ukraine as a springboard to invade and destroy Russia via NATO. We need this demilitarization, this imminent threat of the Ukraine military. These fake stories about Ukraine constructing a dirty nuclear bomb and chemical weapons they're planning to use against Russia. The victimization part, right? The ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine are incurring a genocide. They're being killed off, right? This tying it back to this humiliation of losing Soviet control in Eastern Europe. Even saying the West was behind the Chechnya war that cost Russia 10,000 troops over a 10-year period. That was actually Western mercenaries that were from NATO we were fighting, not really native Chechens. And of course, the dehumanization. You know, Putin's constant referral to the Ukrainians as Nazis and neo-Nazis, right? This hated group. And saying that they're forcing on us their false values from the West, attitudes that are directly leading to degradation and degeneration because they are contrary to human nature. And of course, it's not surprising in light of that we're having all of these stories coming out about war crimes and people investigating them for genocide in these different international bodies. And you say, well, how does all this new technology play in this? Well, You know, if you look at genocide prevention, it has to be more than just not forgetting with various memorials. You have to do something about this hate story, right? Recognize it and countering it, educating people, perhaps at a very young age, to look for these exaggerated threats and this dehumanization of groups and this encouraging of this victimization that happens. And I mentioned this new technology. How does that play into it? Well, in some ways, it's good that it's more difficult to hide genocide, right? They have the cell phones and everything else that we can see real-time pictures of this stuff going. It's tough to cover it up. But it also makes it easier to target and spread false information among people. And Putin's been very effective at isolating the Russian people from what's going on and controlling what goes through the internet and goes through the media to them. And of course, we see this type of thing, unfortunately, with the polarization of America. Because if you look at this system of threats and the name calling and the victimization, it's almost like a format that many talk radio show hosts, or maybe the outline for the way many politicians make their speech. And of course, social media gets just full of this type of thing. And it gets very difficult to police or stop out because there's a large pushback against doing anything about this in our country. It's the pushback against hate speech gets mocked as political correctness or the woke culture or the cancel culture. People saying words are not violence, truth is the new hate speech. This particular cartoon saying that by stopping hate speech, you stop free speech. There's this difficult thing in the United States of people saying that that's part of the freedom of speech. But it comes at a price. Because when you look at the vaccines and masking, we have seen a lot of this same type of format of hate speech talking out against it, right? In terms of the threats to these false rumors, how these vaccines are dangerous, the victimization about how it's infringing upon your rights to force you to wear a mask and get vaccines and all this. And then the dehumanization, all these people that do this are hiding in their basements, walking around wearing face diapers. Well, there's harmless hate stories in the media. You look, we've got almost 1 million people that have died of COVID. And we've had close to 600,000 people that died in 2021, well after the vaccines were widely available. And they estimate over 80%, many people say it's much higher to that, way in the high 90s, of the 2021 deaths, I should say 2021 deaths, were unvaccinated people. So you'll look at the arithmetic there and you say, well, you've got about close to 500,000 total deaths that could have been avoided with vaccination that occurred in 2021. And that was kind of driven by this kind of hate story. And you say, well, geez, when you match against those deaths from that hate story against the deaths from some of these other genocide hate stories, it would be regarded as one of the larger ones, right? So these hate stories can be very, very, very harmful. How do we discourage genocide today? Well, one area would be standing with Ukraine, helping with giving to different charities, some very good charities trying to support the refugees, supporting politicians who are trying to support Ukraine. And then in the meantime, of course, as Ukrainians would say, keep calm, it's Slava Ukraini. You'll hear this expression a lot, and you'll see it in Ukraine. A lot of the graffiti you see written on a sidewalk or a building, and sometimes they'll sneak up and write this on Russian trucks or tanks, is that expression. And what it is, an expression that goes way, way back. Matter of fact, you'll hear this expression often said by the Ukrainian soldiers when they'll interview them. You know, they'll ask them a question, they'll say a bunch of stuff about military tactics, and at the end they'll toss it, Slava Ukraini, right? And that goes way back to the 1800s. There's a famous poet, Taras Shevchenko, Ukrainian poet, who said this in one of his poems. It translates into glory to Ukraine. And it became a rallying cry during Ukrainian war for independence and during 1917 to 1921. But when the Soviets took over the Ukraine, they outlawed that phrase. It was punishable by jail to either be caught writing this or saying this phrase in public. So when the Soviet Union fell later on, after Gorbachev, then this phrase came out. And now that the battle is going on with the Russian invasion, this phrase has resurfaced as a phrase for Ukrainian unity. Well, I hope you support Ukraine and perhaps some of the charities that are trying to support the refugees, and you're more educated and on guard against hate speech and could recognize it in our everyday society and recognize it for what it is. So with that, I'm going to close my presentation and we'll see if Stacy can stop the recording at this point, and then we'll open up the microphones to see if you have any questions about what I spoke about.